I drove for the Queen for 31 years. That's the first thing you should know about me. Not because it makes me important. It doesn't. But because a man who has spent that long with his hands on the same steering wheel learns things. He learns the sound a person makes when they are pretending to be calm. He learns which silences are ordinary and which ones are hiding something. And on the morning I'm going to tell you about, the palace was full of the second kind. My name doesn't matter much. Everyone at Ellesmere just called me Emmett or the old driver, and after a while I stopped correcting the young ones who thought that was a job title and not a name. I'm past 70 now. My knees ache when it rains, which in Marin is most days, but my eyes are still good. Remember that. My eyes were always good. The Queen, Queen Aveline, God keep her, had been dead for 11 months. You have to understand what that did to a place like Ellesmere. It wasn't like a light going out. It was slower than that. It was like watching a house lose its heat in winter, one room at a time. First, the small things stopped. The flowers she liked in the East Hall weren't ordered anymore. Then the bigger things. Her rooms were locked. Her chair was moved. And people who had smiled at each other for years began to walk past one another without looking up, because grief makes strangers of people, and money makes them worse. There was a lot of money to argue over. There always is when a queen dies. But this story isn't really about money. Keep that in your head, even when it looks like it is. It's about a car. Down at the far end of the palace grounds, past the stables that hadn't held horses since the old king's day, there's a long stone garage. Cold. Smells of oil and dust and faintly of the leather the queen liked. Inside it we kept the fleet. The official cars, the ones with the flags, the armored ones. And at the very back, under a gray canvas sheet that I put there myself the week after the funeral, sat her car. Not a state car. Not one of the shining black ones the whole country recognized. This was an old thing. A deep green motor car, maybe 40 years old, the kind they don't make anymore, with round headlamps like a pair of surprised eyes. She had it before she was even queen. Bought it herself, back when she was just a girl who happened to be born into the wrong family for a quiet life. She loved that car more than any crown she ever wore. I know, because I heard her say it once, and she wasn't smiling when she said it. After she died, nobody touched it. There was no reason to. It wasn't worth much on paper. It wasn't part of any official inventory that mattered to the men in gray suits. It just sat there, under its sheet, gathering the kind of dust that feels almost holy after a while. Until the order came. I remember the day the order came, because it was the same day the new boy started. His name was Tomas Rell, 19 years old if he was a day. First week in the guard, the real guard, not the training grounds. You could tell just by looking at him. His uniform was too new. The red of it hadn't faded the way ours had. His boots caught the light. And he stood the way they all stand in the first week, too straight, like he was afraid that if he relaxed even a little, someone would notice he was human and send him home. They posted him at the garage wing. Now that's a strange posting for a first-week boy. The garage wing is the quiet end of the world. Nothing happens there. No tourists, no cameras, no visiting dignitaries to salute. Just me, the oil smell, and the cars. When I saw them post a fresh recruit down there, I thought it was a punishment, or a mistake, or somebody's idea of easing the boy in gently. I know better now. They put him there because they thought a boy who didn't know anything would see nothing. They wanted eyes at that garage, but they wanted young eyes, untrained eyes, eyes that would stand a post for 8 hours and understand exactly none of what they were guarding. They picked wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first morning, Tomas didn't say a word to me. That was proper. Guards on duty aren't meant to chat with the staff. But I've made a whole life out of watching people who are trying not to be watched, and I watched him, and I saw something I liked. His eyes moved. Most of the young ones stare at a fixed point. They're taught to. Chin level, gaze forward, don't react. And Tomas did all of that. But underneath it, his eyes were working, taking things in. When a delivery van came too close to the west door, his eyes went to it and came back. When I dropped a wrench and it rang out against the stone floor, his eyes flicked to me just for a heartbeat and then away. He was disciplined, but he was awake, and there's a difference, believe me, that most people never learn to see. I made him a cup of tea that first afternoon, set it on the low wall near his post without a word so it wouldn't count against him. He didn't touch it while he was on duty, but when his relief came at 6 and he stepped down, he picked it up, cold as it was, and drank the whole thing. Then he looked at me and gave me a small nod. Just that, a nod. We became friends the way old men and young men sometimes do, slowly and without ever saying so. The order about the car came 3 days later. It came from Lord Casimir Vane. I should tell you about Vane, though it turns my stomach to give him this much of the story. He was the late Queen's nephew, her sister's boy, and when Aveline died with no children of her own, that was its own long sorrow, but not for today. The crown passed into a tangle of councils and regents and lawyers, and out of that tangle, Casimir Vane climbed to the very top. Lord Steward of Marin they made him, which meant that until the succession was settled, he held the keys to nearly everything. He was a handsome man, if you like the type, smooth, smiled a great deal, wore his grief like a good coat, exactly the right weight, never a wrinkle. The newspapers loved him. He said all the right things about his dear late aunt. I'd driven that man perhaps 100 times over the years, and in all those 100 times, I never once saw his smile reach his eyes. The order was simple on the face of it. The green car was to be decommissioned, removed from the grounds, taken to a yard outside the city and disposed of, sold for parts or crushed. The paperwork wasn't fussy about which. It was described as clutter, an old vehicle of no value, taking up space that the estate needed. It was to be done quietly, within the week, no fuss. I read that order standing in the cold garage with my reading glasses low on my nose, and something in my chest went tight. Because here is the thing, I knew that car. I knew every inch of it. I had cleaned it, tuned it, driven it, and I had put that gray sheet over it with my own 2 hands. And I knew, I had always known, in the way you know a thing you were never quite told, that the Queen cared about that car in a way that had nothing to do with its engine. She used to sit in it. Did you know that? In her last year, when she was ill and the days were long, she'd have me bring her down to the garage, just the 2 of us, and she'd sit in the passenger seat of that old green car with her hands in her lap and look out through the dusty windscreen at the stone wall, and she'd say nothing at all. 20 minutes, half an hour. Then she'd pat my arm and say, "Thank you, Emmett. Take me back up now." I never asked her what she was thinking. It wasn't my place. But I'll tell you what I thought, standing there with that order in my shaking hand. I thought, they don't crush a thing that has no value, not quietly, not within the week, not with a lord's name on the paper. You crush a thing that has too much. I went looking for Tomas. He was at his post, of course, straight-backed, red coat, eyes forward. I couldn't speak to him properly with the day's shift about, so I did the only thing I could. I walked past him slowly, and as I passed, low, without moving my lips much, I said, "That green car at the back, don't let it leave without me knowing." He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. For a second I thought he hadn't heard me, or that I'd made a mistake, that this stiff new boy would report me for whispering nonsense on the post. Then, so small I nearly missed it, he shifted his weight, just once, from one boot to the other and back. It was a yes. I knew it was a yes, and something in me eased just a little. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in my little room over the old coach house, and I listened to the rain on the roof, and I thought about the Queen, about the way she sat in that car, about the way Casimir Vane smiled, about how a man that rich and that powerful could possibly care whether one old motorcar was crushed on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. There was only one answer that made sense, and it frightened me because if I was right, then that car was not clutter at all. It was a message the Queen had left behind, hidden for somebody to find. and Casimir Vane wanted it gone before that somebody ever could. Now I want to be honest with you the way I'd want a man to be honest with me. I didn't know that night what was in the car. I want to make that clear. I'm an old driver, not a magician. I couldn't see through steel. All I had was a tight chest and 31 years of learning to trust it. But I did know one thing for certain. The Queen had asked me once near the end for a promise. She'd taken my hand, her hand so light by then like a bird's, and she'd said, "Emmett, if anything ever happens to my car, you make sure an honest person is the one who opens it. Promise me that. Not a clever person. An honest one. There's a difference." And I'd promised. God help me, I'd promised, and then I'd half forgotten it, the way you do with the strange things dying people say, until the order came with Vane's name on it, and the whole thing came back to me cold and clear. An honest person, not a clever one. I lay there in the dark, and I thought of the smooth, clever men who wanted that car crushed. And then I thought of a 19-year-old boy with a two-new coat, standing his first post at the quiet end of the world, who shifted his weight from one boot to the other because he didn't have the words to say yes. I don't believe in much anymore. You lose most of your beliefs by 70. But I'll tell you, lying there that night, I believed that the Queen had reached out from wherever she was and put the right boy at the right door. The next morning, the fog was thick off the river. You couldn't see the palace roofs from the garage. The whole world was the color of old milk, and sound came muffled and strange through it. The men came for the car at 10. 3 of them, a flatbed truck, and a 4th man standing to the side in a gray coat with his hands behind his back watching. I didn't know his name then. I learned it later. He was Vane's man. His name was Rourke, and he had the flattest eyes I have ever seen on a living face. They had the paperwork. Of course they did. Men like that always have the paperwork. Rourke handed it to the day shift sergeant, and the sergeant read it and shrugged, because on paper it was nothing, an old car, a lord's order, a Tuesday. They pulled the gray sheet off the green car. And I swear to you, standing there in the fog, I felt it like a hand around my heart, because for 11 months that car had been hers, hidden and quiet and safe. And now it sat there bare in the cold light with strangers' hands on it, and it looked so small and so alone, and I thought, I promised her. I promised her, and I'm standing here doing nothing. Then I looked at Tomas. He was at his post beside the garage door, red coat gone dark at the shoulders from the damp, eyes forward, and I watched him watch those men wheel the Queen's car toward the flatbed truck, and I saw the exact moment his jaw tightened. Because Rourke had made a mistake. A small one, the kind only an awake pair of eyes would ever catch. When they'd pulled the sheet off, Rourke had stepped forward fast, too eager, and put his hand flat on the trunk of that car. The boot at the back. He pressed his palm against it, just for a second, the way you'd steady something precious. Not the way you touch a thing you're about to crush for scrap. And then, catching himself, he'd taken his hand away and wiped it on his coat, as though the car were dirty. Nobody else saw it. The sergeant was reading paperwork. The other men were dealing with straps and ramps. The fog swallowed the small things. But Tomas saw it. I saw him see it. And I did the only thing I could do. I caught his eye just for a moment across the cold garage, through the thin fog, and I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet, not like this, but don't let it go. He held my gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he faced front again, straight as a blade. The men strapped the Queen's green car onto the flatbed. Rourke signed a paper. The engine of the truck coughed and caught, loud and ugly in the muffled morning, and they began slowly to drive her away. I stood there with my old hands hanging useless at my sides, and I thought, this is it. I've failed her. 11 months I kept it safe, and I'm going to lose it in the last 100 yards because I'm too old to do anything but watch. The truck reached the garage gate. And that was when the 19-year-old boy in the 2 new coats stepped out of his post, walked into the middle of the road, and raised one gloved hand. "Stop," said Tomas Rel. His voice shook. I heard it shake, but he didn't move. And the whole gray morning seemed to hold its breath. You'd have to know the guard to understand what Tomas had just done. A guardsman does not leave his post. It's not a suggestion. It's the whole spine of the thing. You stand where they put you and you stay there, and the world can burn down around your boots and still you stay, because the day a guard decides for himself when the rules matter is the day there's no guard left at all. And this boy, 19, first week, a coat still stiff at the seams, had walked off his post into the road and put his hand up to stop a truck carrying a lord's own order. For a moment nobody knew what to do. Even Rourke, with those flat eyes, just stared at him through the windscreen. Then the day shift sergeant came striding over, red in the face. Sergeant Hale, his name was. A big man, 20 years in, not cruel but not soft either, and right then he looked like he wanted to put Tomas through a wall. "Rel," he barked, "back to your post now." Tomas didn't move. "Sergeant," he said, and I'll give him this, his voice still shook but it didn't drop. "I have reason to believe this vehicle should not leave the grounds." "Reason?" Hale said the word like it was something he'd scraped off his boot. "What reason?" And here's where I held my breath, because the boy had nothing, no proof, no orders, nothing but a man's hand pressed too gently against a trunk in the fog and a whisper from an old driver the night before and a feeling. That's all he had, a feeling. If he'd been clever, he'd have known that a feeling is not enough to stop a lord's truck, and he'd have stepped aside and gone back to his post and told himself it wasn't his business. But the Queen hadn't asked for clever, she'd asked for honest. Tomas looked Hale dead in the eye and said, "Because a man doesn't steady a thing he's about to crush." Hale blinked. "That man," Tomas went on, nodding at Rourke, "put his hand on the trunk like it was made of glass. You don't do that to scrap. I think there's something in this car, and I think if it leaves these grounds we'll never know what." For a second, 1 second, I saw Sergeant Hale hesitate, because Hale wasn't a fool. 20 years in the guard teaches a man to smell a wrong note too, and something in what the boy said landed. But then Rourke got out of the truck. He came around slow, unhurried, buttoning his gray coat against the cold, and he smiled the same smile his master wore. "There's no need for all this," he said, easy as anything. "It's an old car. Here's the order signed by the Lord Steward himself. This young man is confused. First week, I'm told. Nerves." He looked at Tomas the way you'd look at a dog that had wandered into the road. "No harm done. Send him back to his post, Sergeant, and we'll all forget it." It was smoothly done. I'll admit that. Every word aimed to make Tomas small, confused, nervous, a boy who didn't understand. And I watched Hale's face and I saw him start to buy it, because it's the easy thing to buy, and the easy thing is what tired men reach for. And that's when I stepped forward. I'm an old man. My knees were screaming from the cold, but I stepped out of the shadow of the garage door into the gray light and I said, loud enough to carry, "He's not confused, and he's not the only one who thinks that car shouldn't leave." Everyone turned. Rourke's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker. He knew who I was. Of course he did. Vane's people would have known the Queen's old driver on sight. "You've something to say, have you?" Rourke said, not a question. "I've 31 years to say," I told him. "I drove that woman more miles than any man alive. And I'm telling you, that car meant something to her that a scrapyard's got no business touching. So before it goes anywhere, somebody's going to open the trunk in the daylight in front of witnesses. And if there's nothing in it, well, then I'm just a foolish old man and you can crush it with my blessing." I let that sit. "But if there's nothing in it," I said, softer, "then why did your man touch it like his own mother?" The silence after that was a thing you could have leaned against. Rourke's jaw worked. He looked at Hale and I watched him calculate. I watched him decide whether he could simply order the sergeant to clear us aside and drive on. And he could have. He had the paper. He had the master's name. He nearly did it. But there were too many eyes now. The commotion had drawn others. A pair of gardeners had stopped by the wall. Two kitchen girls stood in a doorway with their aprons still on. A relief guard had come to see what the shouting was. And Rourke was a clever man, and clever men know that the one thing you cannot do a bad deed in front of is a crowd. "Fine," he said at last, and the ease had gone out of his voice, gone cold and clipped. "Open it. Prove your ghost stories. And when it's empty, old man, the Lord Steward will hear how his aunt's driver and a boy in his first week held up palace business over a bad feeling." He was gambling, betting that whatever was hidden well enough that a rushed look wouldn't find it, betting that open it would satisfy us and we'd find a dark, empty boot and slink away ashamed. He didn't know about the promise. He didn't know what the Queen had told me once in a moment I'd nearly forgotten. Because she'd told me more than, "Let an honest man open it." She'd told me where. I want to slow down here, because this is the part I've told over and over in my own head since, on the nights I can't sleep. They lowered the ramp. They rolled the green car back off the flatbed onto the wet stone, and Rourke gestured at the trunk like a man daring us to embarrass ourselves. "Well," he said, "go on." The trunk was locked, of course, and nobody had the key. The Queen's keys had gone into the estate with everything else, sealed away in Vane's own office. But I'm the driver. I've been the driver for 31 years. And do you think in 31 years I never once had to get into a locked car? There's a way. There's always a way if your hands know the shape of the thing. I knelt at the back of that car, my knees, dear God, my knees. And I worked the old lock the way she'd shown me 100 years ago, and it gave with a sound like a small cough. The trunk lid rose, and there was nothing in it. I want you to feel that the way I felt it, because for one long, terrible moment the trunk was empty, just the bare gray lining, a folded blanket, a coil of jump leads, the ordinary junk of an old car. Rourke made a sound in his throat, half a laugh. "There," he said, satisfied, "a blanket and some cables. Shall I call the Lord Steward now, or would you like to embarrass yourselves further?" The kitchen girls looked away. Sergeant Hale let out a breath. Even Tomas, I saw the doubt cross his young face, the awful thought that maybe he really was just a nervous boy who'd made a fool of himself in his first week. And I knelt there, an old man with wet knees, and I thought, no, she told me where. Because she hadn't said in the trunk. Those weren't her words. I'd been remembering it wrong all night, and only now, kneeling in front of the empty boot, did the exact words come back to me, clear as her voice in my ear. "Under the floor, Emmett, where a man in a hurry never looks." The trunk had a false floor. Every car of that make did, a shallow panel over the spare wheel well, and in that moment I understood everything. Rourke's man had touched the trunk gently, not because of what was in the trunk, but because of what was under it. And a man in a hurry, a clever man ordered to make a car disappear, would have opened it, seen the blanket and the cables, and driven straight to the scrapyard, never once thinking to lift the floor. The Queen knew that. She'd counted on it. She'd hidden her secret not in a safe, not in a vault, but in the one place too plain for a clever man to search. "Move the blanket," I said. "This is finished," Rourke started. "Move the blanket," I roared, and my old voice cracked on it, and I hadn't shouted like that in years, and it startled even me. Tomas moved first. He stepped past Rourke, right past him, close enough that Rourke could have grabbed him and didn't dare, not with all those eyes, and he reached into the trunk and lifted out the blanket and the jump leads and set them aside. And then his young fingers found the little recessed catch at the edge of the false floor, and he looked back at me once, and I nodded. He lifted the panel. I have thought about that moment more than any other in my long life. The way the gray light fell into the wheel well, the way everyone leaned in at once, the gardeners and the girls and the sergeant, drawn like it was warmth on a cold day, the way the fog seemed to go still. Under the floor, wrapped in soft dark velvet the color of a winter night, was a shape. Long, flat, heavier than it looked. I could tell by the way Tomas's arms took the weight when he lifted it out. He set it on the closed trunk lid. His hands were shaking now too, I could see it, but he unfolded the velvet, corner by corner, careful as if it might break. And the diamonds caught the light. I'd seen jewels before. 31 years at a palace, you see plenty. But I had never seen anything like this, and neither had anyone standing in that cold garage yard. Not crown jewels, nothing so gaudy. These were finer than that. A river of them, set in old white gold, necklaces and brooches and loose stones bedded in the velvet, and even in that flat gray fog they threw back light like they had a fire of their own kept somewhere inside. One of the kitchen girls made a small sound and put her hand over her mouth. Nobody spoke, nobody breathed. The whole yard just stared at a fortune lying on the trunk of an old green car, and above it all hung the one impossible question. Why? Why would a queen hide a river of diamonds in the boot of a car she meant to have crushed? I looked at Rourke. The smile was gone. Every scrap of ease had drained out of his face, and what was left was pale and tight and afraid, because he had gambled that the trunk was empty and he had lost in front of a dozen witnesses. His flat eyes darted to the diamonds, to the gate, to the truck, calculating still, always calculating, whether there was any version of the next minute where he came out of this clean. And then he did the thing that told us all, past any doubt, exactly what kind of man he was. He went for the diamonds. He lunged forward, both hands out, to sweep that velvet and everything on it off the trunk and into his own coat. I don't know what he thought he'd do. Run, hide it. I don't think he was thinking at all by then, and for a heartbeat it looked like he might reach them. But Tomas Rel was faster. The boy stepped in and took Rourke's wrist out of the air and turned it, the way they teach you in training, clean and hard, and Rourke went down onto one knee on the wet stone with a cry, his arm bent up behind him, the diamonds untouched on the trunk between them. "You do not," said Tomas, and his voice didn't shake at all now, not one bit, "touch the queen's things." And the whole yard erupted. It took 4 men to sort out the noise of the next few minutes, and I'll not pretend I remember all of it in order. Sergeant Hale shouting for the gate to be closed. Rourke on his knees, then hauled up, red-faced, snarling about the Lord Steward, about consequences, about how every man in that yard would lose his post by morning. The kitchen girls gone to fetch someone senior. The relief guards pouring in. But through all of it, one thing did not move. Tomas Rel stood over that trunk with the diamonds behind him and his hands loose at his sides, and he did not let a single soul near them. Not Hale, not the other guards, nobody. He decided in that quiet, stubborn way of his that these things had been the queen's and would stay untouched until someone with the right to say so said otherwise, and a boy who will stand off a lord's truck is not going to be moved by a shouting sergeant. It was me who found the letter. When the worst of the noise had settled, when Rourke had been marched off, still shouting, to a room with a locked door and 2 guards outside it, I went back to the car. And I don't know what made me look. Instinct, maybe. 31 years of knowing where a careful person hides things. But I put my hand back into the wheel well, right at the far edge, past where the velvet had lain, and my fingers found paper. An envelope. Cream, gone a little soft at the corners from the damp of 11 months. And on the front, in a hand I would have known anywhere, I'd seen it on 1,000 notes over 31 years, 3 words. To an honest finder. My eyes stung. I won't be ashamed to tell you that. An old man, kneeling on wet stone, holding a letter his dead queen had written to a person she would never meet, trusting, just trusting, on nothing but faith, that someone honest would one day be the one to find it. She'd been right. God help me, she'd been right. I stood and my knees screamed and I didn't care. I held the letter up so they could all see it. She left this, I said, in her own hand, and I think it should be read aloud here now in front of every person standing in this yard, so there can never be any question about what she wanted. Hale looked at me a long moment, then he nodded. I could have read it myself, but I didn't. I've told you why the Queen chose Tomas. I believe that to this day, and it seemed only right. I put the letter into the boy's hands. You found it, I said. You read it. He looked terrified, more terrified than he'd looked facing down the truck. But he opened the envelope with careful fingers, and he unfolded the single sheet inside, and in the gray light of that foggy morning, in a voice that started small and grew steadier with every line, Tomas Rell read the Queen's last honest words to her kingdom. I've read that letter so many times since that I could recite it in my sleep. I won't give it to you word for word. Some things should stay half private, even now. But I'll tell you what it said, because you've come this far and you deserve to know. She wrote that the diamonds were hers, her own. Not crown jewels, not state property, jewels she had been given and bought across a long life, jewels that were hers to do with as she pleased. She was very clear about that. She had, she wrote, taken good legal care to make it so, precisely because she feared what came next. Because there was a place, a home out past the edge of the city called St. Bride's, a house for children who had no one, the ones nobody counts, she wrote, the ones a kingdom forgets it has. She had paid for it quietly for 40 years, never her name on it, never a photograph, just money, sent every season, keeping the roof sound and the beds warm and the children fed. And she had learned in her last year that when she died, there were those who meant to close it, to sell the land, to fold the money back into the estate where it would vanish into ledgers and lawyers and the pockets of clever men. She named no one in the letter. She didn't have to. We all knew, standing in that yard, exactly whose name she'd left off the page. So she had done the only thing she could think to do. She could not trust the law had been got at. She could not trust the court had been got at. So she took her own diamonds, worth more than St. Bride's would need for 100 years, and she hid them in the boot of the one thing nobody would think to search, an old green car she'd loved since before she was queen. And she trusted that when the clever men came to make it disappear, an honest hand, not a clever one, an honest one, would be the one to open it. If you are reading this, she wrote near the end, then you are that honest person. I never knew your name and I am sorry for that, but I knew you would come. People always tell me I trust too easily, perhaps, but I would rather be a fool who trusted and was proven right than a wise woman who trusted no one at all. Take these. See that St. Bride's is safe. And know that a dead woman is grateful to you, whoever you are, more than you will ever understand. Tomas's voice broke on the last line. 19 years old, in front of a yard full of people, and he stood there with the letter shaking in his hands and tears on his face, and he did not wipe them away, because a guard doesn't move his hands to hide that he's human. Not anymore. He'd learned that lesson an hour before in the middle of a road with his hand up in front of a truck. Nobody in that yard said a word. The kitchen girls were crying. Sergeant Hale, big, 20 years in Sergeant Hale, had turned his face away and was looking very hard at the wall. And me, I was smiling. I couldn't stop, because I'd promised her and I'd nearly failed, and then a boy in a new coat had kept the promise for me. You'll want to know how it ended. People always do. So let me tell you plainly without dressing it up, because the plain telling is the best telling for a thing like this. Casimir Vane fell. Not all at once, men like him never fall all at once. But that letter, read in front of a dozen witnesses, was the loose thread that unraveled the whole coat. There were questions. Then there were investigations. Then there were papers found in the estate office that never should have existed, and a will that had been misplaced, and quiet arrangements to close St. Bride's that suddenly could not survive the daylight. He never wore the crown he'd been climbing toward. Last I heard, he'd left Marin altogether, and good riddance, and I'll waste no more words on him. Rourke, the man with the flat eyes, told everything he knew in exchange for a lighter fate. It's how those men always end, loyal right up until loyalty costs them something. The diamonds went where the Queen wanted them to go, every last stone. There was a great deal of ceremony about it in the end, which she'd have hated, but at least the ceremony was for the right thing. St. Bride's is still open. It'll stay open now for longer than any of us will live. They put up a small plaque by the door, nothing grand. She'd not have wanted grand, that just says the home is kept by the gift of a friend who wished to remain unknown. She'd have liked that, a friend who wished to remain unknown. 40 years she managed it. It took her own death to give her away. And Tomas, they didn't discipline him for leaving his post. There was talk of it at first, rules are rules, and he'd broken a big one. But it's hard to punish a boy for stopping a theft, and harder still once the whole kingdom heard the story. He stayed in the guard. He's a sergeant himself now, if you can believe it. Still straight-backed. But his coat's faded to the proper color, and his eyes still move, still take everything in, and God help any man who tries to walk something past that boy's post in the fog. He comes to see me sometimes, sits with me in the old coach house and drinks tea that I let go cold on purpose for old time's sake. We don't talk about it much. We don't need to. But once, just once, he asked me. He said, "Emmett, how did you know? How did you know there was something in that car?" And I told him the truth. I said, I didn't. I only knew she asked me to make sure an honest man opened it. I spent all night worrying I couldn't keep that promise. And then I looked at you. He didn't say anything to that. He just looked into his cold tea for a while. Then he nodded that same small nod he gave me on the very first day, over the very first cup, and that was enough. I'm an old man now, older than I was when this started, and I was old then. My driving days are done. My knees saw to that. Most days I just sit by the garage and watch the young ones come and go in their 2 new coats, and I remember a woman who sat in the passenger seat of an old green car and looked out at a stone wall and said nothing at all. I used to wonder, all those quiet half hours, what she was thinking about. Now I know. She was thinking about the children. She was thinking about the clever men who'd come for them once she was gone. And she was thinking, I believe, about faith, about whether it was a foolish thing to hide everything that mattered inside an old car and simply trust that somewhere out there was a person honest enough to find it. People tell you the world runs on clever men. Don't believe them. The world's full of clever men, and half of them would have driven that car straight to the scrapyard and never looked under the floor. It runs on the honest ones, the quiet ones, the 19-year-old boy who walks off his post into the road because a thing feels wrong and he can't bear to let it pass. She trusted that such a person existed. Everyone told her she trusted too easily. She was right and they were wrong, and I got to live long enough to see it. That's the whole of it. That's the story of the day a boy opened a dead queen's car and found what she'd hidden there, not just the diamonds, but the faith she'd wrapped around them. And if you ever doubt that one honest person can still matter in this world of clever ones, well, come down to the garage sometime. I'll make you a cup of tea, and I'll let it go cold, and I'll tell you about a green car and a boy who kept a promise he never even knew he'd made.